People of African Descent New Thought Group proudly present Celebrating Our Soul, Consciously Creating Change. Our partner, New Thought Media Network, is offering this interview series to highlight some of the luminaries who will present at this amazing event. For more information, go to padntg.com. Stay tuned for a wonderful interview. Peace and blessings.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here with Reverend Dereca, someone I met at the Religious Science Conference in New Orleans a few years ago. And we are here today to talk about the upcoming conference of people of African descent, New Thought Group of Celebrating Our Soul, which will be August 1st through the 4th in Unity Village. The title is Consciously Creating Change. And so we are here and we are in for a treat. And so welcome. How are you this morning?
I am so wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a great opportunity to talk about something great that's happening in our community and world. So I'm glad to be here.
Yes. And we're glad that you're here. Now, just to get started, let's do the customary things, which is, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, how you got into ministry, your entry into the social justice work, which is the theme of the conference, and just share that journey and path with us.
Absolutely. So the story always starts with being from Detroit. So I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and it has a lot to do with who I am as a person, how I show up in the world, growing up in what I like to call the Wakanda of the United States, really gave me an opportunity to have a very unlimited view of Blackness as an identity. And then I went, was in the Upper Bound programs, and I got a scholarship to boarding school in East Hampton, Massachusetts, and then I ended up at Stanford in Palo Alto, California. So what I like to tell when I do my diversity inclusion talks is that I'm an early survivor of culture shock. But what also happened to me in that process was that I learned that if I wanted to, I could be a representative for my culture, my background, not only as a Black person, but also as a person from a low-income background. And that there were all these myths and just people were just really ignorant of my community, my city where I'm from, my culture. So I've always been that person who's been trying to bridge the gap of people's lack of information and lack of understanding. So I was that ambassador, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by choice, but I leaned into it. And it sort of felt to me that to whom much is given, much is required piece, that I had these scholarships and I had this access to higher education in a way that some of my peers who were equally talented didn't have. So that's really, I think, the thing that made me invest in social justice from the beginning, is that I felt like, wow, people have a grave misunderstanding of my community and my identity. And then to have access to tables of power and to be able to talk to people there to say, not only did they have misunderstandings, they were misapplying those understandings with everything from nonprofit, foundation policy to, policing. And so there were all of these places for me to speak to the underestimation, the devaluation of Black folks. And it'd be like, this is not the reality for these young people here. So I feel like that's always been my ministry, even before I answered the call. So I think I like to say I got the call in 1996. I was actually doing some public speaking, and there was a woman, Reverend Emma Jordan Sampson, who is out of Brooklyn, New York. And I came back to my seat and she had written on a piece of paper, answer that call. And she wrote down Union Theological Seminary, which is where she went. And I carried that piece of paper for years with this sort of secret thing, like, there's no way I could be a minister. I curse like a sailor. Like, how could I possibly, there's no room for me in this thing. But I persisted in my path of service to community, and I worked in youth development for 19 years. And I decided that it was time to retire. I was 38. And people say you can't retire at 38. I was like, 500 young people in Oakland have my phone number. I'm retiring. And 6 months later, Oscar Grant III was killed in Oakland, California by transit police while lying face down on a platform. He was shot in the back. And it was one of the first internationally popularized videos of an officer shooting for an unarmed Black citizen. And it changed everything. And I had just gotten out of my nonprofit leadership job. And I just knew as a mother, people ask me all the time about it. I responded as a mother because his mother put him on the BART train to keep him safe on New Year's Eve. So I got to meet him, her, the other young men who were on the platform, and I just got really involved. But I came to ministerial school because of that. So in the middle of all of the organizing and protesting and everything that we did, I had that tension, that spiritual bypass, sacred activism tension. Reverend E, the minister emeritus at East Bay Church, where I'm the senior minister now, Reverend E called me on the phone. She said, I just saw you screaming on television. A practitioner is the presence of peace. And I was like, no justice, no peace. Like there was, it's not, but I felt that tension. And so I was renaming the rally, working for justice, praying for peace. I was doing all this stuff. But there was a moment where someone in the movement threw red paint on the woman at the BART board and said, the blood is on your hands. And I was like, no, now this is my line. We can't become the thing that we're protesting against. Now, I don't mind anger, and property destruction is not the same as life destruction. We talk about that later. But that's when I went to ministerial school. I've always been unapologetically Black. I wanted to be unapologetically spiritual. I wanted you to know that if you called me, we were going to have prayer as part of whatever was going to happen. And that's what sent me to ministerial school. So that's the story of sacred activism and ministry and how they came together for me, because it's through my activism that I finally answered the call and went to ministerial school.
Hey, nice story. And I apologize that I did not indicate at the very beginning that Reverend Dereca Blackmon is the senior minister at the East Bay Church of Religious Science in Oakland, California. So I am remiss. When I see you at the conference, I'll take my whooping gracefully.
It's totally fine. One other thing I'll say in introduction is I usually introduce myself with my pronouns, which are she or they. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. And I like to do that because I teach people about allyship. And it's a small act of allyship that I can do for a community that I'm not centered in, right? So non-binary and trans folks, just saying my pronouns signals to them like I see you and the struggle that you have. And so I try to do that.
And that in itself is a form, I believe, of social justice. Because when we look at social justice, I think part of the non-appreciation of it is that people don't recognize people for who they are and where they are. They want everybody to be this monolithic, homogenized representation of this country, if you will. And if you don't fit into that box, or you don't force yourself into that box, then you become the other, which is not something that is productive. And so again, thank you for that introduction of who you are and how you got into this work. So I'd like to ask now, in terms of what are some of the common misconceptions you think about social justice? The conference is going to have a litany of speakers, keynote speakers who have been involved in this work. And I don't know if everyone really knows and understands what this work is and what it involves, and how vulnerable in real life you have to be. So what do you think some of the misconceptions that we're hoping at this conference to Celebrating Our Soul to address, or at least highlight, if nothing else?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception about what I like to call the A word, activism, is that people are afraid of anger. And I always keep handy. I remember I got my Thich Nhat Hanh anger, the family wisdom for cooling the flames. because I like to, if I can talk about Thich Nhat Hanh and anger, people feel okay. It's like, oh, okay, well, Thich Nhat Hanh said it, then it's all right. Um, what he says is, anger is our baby, and we have to take care of it. We have to figure out what it needs, right? So you're not angry at the baby for crying. It's alerting you to the problem. And now you go in and you understand, what is the crying about, right? And so I love that metaphor, because, and also Reverend Deborah Johnson's fire triangle, right? We need fire. We need heat and fuel and oxygen for a fire. But we got to have the heat. And sometimes I could bring the heat. That's what I do. I spark it off. But all over time, I've learned to also bring the fuel, right? And how do we sustain movements? Because anger is not going to sustain a movement. It'll set it off, right? But it's not going to sustain it. And then Reverend Deborah talks about oxygen as the vision. Like, who's talking about where we're going with all of this? And so that, for me, is sacred activism, is about, like, what am I for? Not just what am I against? What am I working toward? What am I building? What is my vision? Because not everybody has a vision that we're all our best selves, that we're all one, right? And so if that's not where you're going, we're not going to the same place, right? And so, I remember Reverend Wanda, Oscar's mom, we were talking about justice, and she was like, what is justice in this case for me? My son's not coming back. What is justice? Right. And so I think about that a lot and recognize that for me, it's building a world where it doesn't keep happening.
Right.
Right. Which is why the work we have to do has to be collective, which is what this conference is about. Is part of this is fuel. How do we sustain our work if we're so isolated sometimes, making ourselves think, are we the only sane ones or are we the crazy ones? I'm not sure what's going on here. But if you don't come together with like-minded people and have that moment where you go, right, yes, yes. If you don't have that, it's hard to keep going in a climate where, everybody's, supporting the war.
Yeah, and the thing that you sparked in my mind is something you brought up earlier about an ambassador. Is, how do we begin, those who are conscious of it and those who just may be entertaining the idea of, how do we begin to be ambassadors for change, ambassadors for social justice, ambassadors for inclusion, which is what this whole idea is about, of social justice, because inevitably it looks as if those who are asking for social justice are those who have been outcast or overlooked, or the broader society looks at as a nuisance, if you will, and that creates this dichotomy of the other, and creates this tension, right? And it could be dynamic tension, which is good or can be good, but unfortunately it always seems, recently anyway, that it becomes antagonistic, and it doesn't become a force to go introspective and to reflect on, okay, yeah, the situation is this, what is my part in it, what can I do to alleviate it, what actions do I need to take as a result of this? And so with that idea in mind, how do you see this conference in general, and the topic in specific of consciously creating change, to do an inclusive thing with not just us, but with everybody else, with the elders, with the children, to create a real inclusive community where that idea of being ambassadors for change, ambassadors for social justice, will help spawn that idea?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's a real opportunity, I ran an organization in Oakland, actually, which was founded by Dr. Sean Jimbright. I was the first ED to run the organization after he left.
Oh, nice.
And he was my board chair. So we've known each other for 20 some years. And one of the things that I found, we would do camps and summer programs specifically targeted for Black youth. And there was always this sort of fear of like, well, how, the Black people are all getting together, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, Dr. Tatum's work. And I would try to explain to people that the research shows that when you come together with people from your own identity, it shores up your confidence, your core, your strength in a way that allows you to better participate in integration, which is why, desegregation was working, is because people came from strong communities and they didn't lose their sense of self when they went into a group together. So here we are at the conference. We have this chance to come together as a group in ways that we never do. We're isolated for the most part. I mean, I'm really blessed because I'm in Oakland, and we have 3 Black female ministers in New Thought, just in CSL, just in Oakland, let alone Red Kev and other people in California that I have access to. So it's a little different for us, but for coming together for this conference, it gives us an opportunity to do something else in service to this ambassadorship, which is to look at intersectionality. Because there's Black folks, and then there's the complicated identities within the Black community, right? So where are we looking at queer identity in the conversation? Where are we looking at the issues that women are facing in their pulpits? Where are we looking at socioeconomic class and education or ability status? Like, these are things that always kind of get pushed off the radar because in the society, Black is such the issue, in American society especially. But, in the world, anti-Blackness is a thing in the world. I teach diversity, inclusion, and corporations, and, the Asians will tell me like, oh, no, we don't have race, or we don't have race, or we don't have racism. I said, but skin whitening is a $34 billion industry, though, isn't it? And why is that? Right. And so I said, you don't call it race, but you do equate beauty, intelligence, wealth with color. So you know what I'm talking about. And then they like, oh, okay. But I'm sorry, I got sidetracked. But when we come together, we have an opportunity to look at deeper issues. And that's what I found when I was running the organization, Leadership Excellence, after that Sean and Nedra created, is when we took Black kids away, they could talk to us about things that they weren't saying in mixed environments. They could have deeper conversations around how they had internalized racism or how they had internalized sexism and what that was showing up like, what their experiences were. You need that. You need that comfort zone where you can be with your folks and say, is this happening to you? That's happening to me too. And then we can talk about our own issues. How are we showing up as allies in the environmental justice movement or whatever else it is? And you get that reminder like I had growing up. My grandparents were senior members of the Black Square Dancers Club. And even Black people ain't heard it. You know what I mean? We like the whole full petticoats and all of that. And so you come to something like celebrating our soul, and you look around and be like, look at Black people. And all the things that we're doing, all the people of African descent, look at all of what we're doing all over the world. And that's uplifting. You got to want that for yourself.
And, again, I love the way these things just flow. You bring up some points that I think are very key. One, and I'll list them and then we'll kind of go through them. One is intersectionality, because this conference is for all New Thought practitioners, whether they're Unity, whether they're divine science, whether they're UFBL, whether they're religious science. So there's although the teachings are based on one central idea, there's some intersectionality because each organization has taken their own path into disseminating this information. That's number one. Number two is that, you talk about the work with the youth, and I look at, one of the things that I'm passionate about is ancient civilizations and ancient wisdom. And when we look at our people from the beginning in the original diaspora, there was a rites of passage program for everybody. There was a rites of passage program for mothers getting ready to bring forth life. There were rites of passages for kids who were moving into their puberty. Then there was the so-called traditional rites of passage to take you from that to the adulthood. And ultimately, you went into eldership and ancestralship. And so, again, when we begin to look at this intersectionality between these different New Thought organizations, the idea of rites of passage and social justice in terms of how do we begin to groom our communities at all levels of what social justice is and how do we prepare for it, like you said earlier, so that I don't react, that I act, that I think
Mhm.
about what's needed. I don't just go violent because the situation seems to dictate that, or I don't spark rhetoric just because it seems that that's what's going on. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts because at the conference there's going to be a youth
Yes.
program there for young people to come. We know we'll have some of our elders that's been involved in this community, and so one thing I would like to do, and one thing I'm working on, is this whole idea of rites of passage within our teaching. I used to do some rites of passage work in New York City. I used to do some here in Denver,
Mhm.
and I can really see the difference. And so I just like to hear you kind of expound on your ideas on those things. I know I threw a lot out there, but I was
No, it's
excited. You
okay.
got
I've done rites of passage where I grew up in a community where rites of passage is a part of, what you do and who you are. And I participated in, created, mentor, like help people structure all of that. So I know how critically important it is. And quite frankly, a big part of that, comedic history is also the mystery systems. And that's what we would have been a part of. That's
yes,
the people that we call ministers, right? That deeper level of study, what was required
yes,
in that, very few of us engage in. When I first came to college, it was my first time really being with the folks who were studying, ancient
hmm
Kemetic, and also
hmm
West African, all, this was Ivan Van Sertima time. Like all of us was reading, all of that, the Stolen Legacy and Black Athena
yes,
and all of that was
yes,
happening.
yes,
And but going to a predominantly white elite institution, I was taught a concept, double study, which is you have to study what they're teaching in the curriculum and know it backwards and forwards, and then be able to challenge it from that place of authority.
yes,
You don't get
yes,
to just go in and throw a critique. You actually have to know what they're talking about and what you're talking about. And I don't think that level of rigor is always taught right anymore. I don't think that's an expectation that people have, that they have to be, um, that there's an expression. I love my organizing expressions. One of them is no investigation, no right to speak,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Until you've done your homework, you don't really get to just come out and critique everybody. And I think that's the culture right now. And I think we perpetuate the culture just by watching what I call the television, right? It's a culture of just flame throwing, right? And
hmm
there's very little on any of the stations that passes as news. This is just, and we listen to it all day and on the radio, in the car. We cannot turn off this constant flame throwing that's not based in any edification or any of that. So when we talk about rites of passage, definitely is something that our young people need. And why they need it so desperately is because we have the absence of physical community, in the way that physical community and the church specifically was the physical community of accountability, of nurturing. We have children come to East Bay, and when I brought my daughter, who will be 27, Reverend E would not let me get up and walk her out of the sanctuary if she started crying. I would get up and she would say, "Sit down. She needs to get used to being in here." Right.
hmm
And now when I have
hmm
kids, there might be kids running around. And I was like, who knows that child besides their parent, who might just, this might be the only moment they have where someone else in the community who knows that child. So
Yeah.
I've created a culture where, we can say, I know your child, and there's someone else that can be a part of a community. We're a community. And I think, I feel like you asked a lot of questions, so I'm going through a whole bunch of different places here.
I know,
But
I know.
I think actually that I have an opportunity that not everyone has. I am also attracting the churched, not just the unchurched, right?
hmm
And so I
hmm
think a lot of people in Oakland still want to go to church because they grew up going to church, and they
Yeah,
just
yeah,
don't want all the hellfire and brimstone and damnation. Also, they also don't want glorified, I've reached enlightenment, I'm so much better than you thing. And so my particular brand, Revenue used to say, ask me how I know. And that's one of my favorite Revenue expressions is I'm going to teach you about what I'm working with, not what I accomplished and overcame. But there's going to be some of that, but this is what I'm working with this week. Right? Here's what's up for me. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what and we're going to work on our stuff together. We're going to close the gap between the pews and the pulpit. So I think that we have to model for our children and for our communities what it looks like to evolve publicly. Because all of this private suppression of us getting through something results in all of this scandal, right? You know, I came, when my grandmother died, I came to church and I wasn't sure I was going to preach. I asked Reverend to preach because she died at like 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning. So I had just found out. And I came there and I had on a robe and no makeup, not like a house robe, but like my robes that I wear for when I'm doing officiating funerals. And I told him I came because I want you to come.
Yeah.
When it's you. And I want you to know you can come in here with no makeup on and just throw on whatever doesn't require ironing and come on. And I cried, they cried, we cried, Jen John sang, and we cried some more. And that's what I think is also a rites of passage for our folks. I've watched somebody lose their grandmother and I see that it's okay for me to break down. I told them I'm not doing okay. I'm not okay. And I love my community because when I said I'm not okay, they all clapped. Yes, tell it, Rev. We love you, right? And I don't think people realize how liberating it is to tell people you don't know, or you made a mistake, or you need forgiveness, or you struggling with something. And it's so liberating for me and for our community, because now we have a different level of authenticity when that's the way we're showing up. I know you, I'm not even sure what the question was, but you brought up rites of passage. Systems.
It's all good because I mean that's when spirit is flowing, because you bring up the point about a couple of points again. One thing my father used to always tell me, he said, I'm telling you what I know, not what I heard, right? And so when we go into social justice work, we need to work from what we know, not from what we heard, because you made this point about that Reverend E says, we're talking about what's right now, and that's and I know this, right? And when we look at this conference, that's the broader title is Celebrating Our Soul, the loss of your grandmother, the part of the community embracing that, and how people respond in community is what Celebrating Our Soul is about, because soul is not some individual thing, it's a collective thing. It is the spirit of the divine that operates through all of us. And so when we can begin to see that, how it works individually, when I have a celebration or a moment of silence, if you will, and how the community can embrace and tap into that, and we can move and groove with that, it becomes magic. And that's why we look at this whole idea of consciously creating change. We begin to consciously do these things and not just something that happens. And so I want to touch on this piece when we look at this whole thing about our people in the diaspora. You brought up about the work of some of our ancestors. There was an organization when I was in New York called First World Alliance. And in that, they would have these Saturday morning, afternoon, really, it took 3-4 hours, where we would go and meet and listen to Dr. Josephine Yakiman, or Dr. John Henry Clark, or Francis Cress Welsing, or Dr. Leonard Jeffries. All these, and it was in a personal, you got to see them, talk to them, have individual conversations with them. And that's the opportunity I think we have at the conference, because we have some powerful speakers from all walks of this teaching. And so how do you think or what are your ideas of how we take these ideas that we're going to be talking about, first celebrating our soul, and then how we infuse that into this social justice work that shows up in many ways, as you had said earlier, whether it's environmental work, whether it's inclusion of the LGBT community or the Asian, any out othered. How do you look at that to say, let's bring all of this information, all of these skills, all of these things, and treat it in this soul way of oneness?
Yeah. Wow.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I love these, multi
Yeah.
layered questions. So I think that takes me back to Reverend Deborah's fire triangle, because I expect we'll come away with all three things. You'll have that fire in your belly. Some moment will happen. You're like, you know what? There's an issue that I feel activated around. This is something that I want to put more energy into. Someone will spark that. You'll have a moment where you're like, that's a thing I need to be doing. And that call will stir. And so that spark, I think, will happen. Some heat under you. Like, I know you've been saying you were going to do this thing. You want to start recycling at your center, but this person really just told you got to do your part, right? Whatever that is, or, pronouns or whatever it is, or, speaking out about the war in Gaza, right? Or the atrocities that have been happening, right? So like everybody's like, Dereca, you talking about it from the pulpit. And I'm like, I'm not going to not talk about it. Like, you knew who I was when you hired me. Like, this is who I am. So there's no version of this world in which I'm not going to say the word genocide. And there's no version of this world in which I'm not going to talk about the need for us to love everybody that we think of as an enemy. I'm going to talk about, yes, we as a organization are pro peace. We are not going to support any war ever. So no war is going to be justified. So I talk about things like that. So somebody's going to get that heat, because you put me on the panel, this is what we're going to talk about. And so somebody's going to get that heat and be like, okay, she's right. We got to speak out, because this politics has no place in the pulpit is ridiculous. I told Reverend Margaret Storrs, who was one of my teachers in ministerial school, love Reverend Margaret. But we went at it. She was like, oh, we don't do politics in the church. I was like, Reverend Margaret, if they didn't do politics in the church, me and you wouldn't be allowed to sit in the same room. And that was the moment she made the connection. She, this is all of what we have has come from the courage to lead. So anyway, but the spark for sure. The fuel, though, I think is actually the biggest thing. Just the relax you get when you go and sit with your people for a few days, and the music is good, and the food is good, and the conversations is good, and somebody is playing spades, and you're just like, oh man, I love us. And that actually adds years to your life and energy to your struggle, whatever issue it is that you're working on. Just the time to be with your folks really is uplifting, if you allow it to be. I mean, some people find, fault with everything, but for me, it's uplifting. And then it's the vision, right? With the keynote speakers that we have coming, you're talking about the forerunners of visioning, the people who put the idea on the map. You're talking Reverend Michael and Reverend Deborah and Reverend Andrea. There's people there who are, and those are just some of the people that all three of those are my teachers. So I pulled them out from the lineup because I've been blessed to step under those three. But there's so many more who will be there. And the inspiration part, Van Jones used to say, Dr. King had a dream, not a complaint. He wasn't just trying to get off the back of the bus. He saw Black children and white children holding hands, right? And that is, Reverend Andrea did a series one time, and she talked about the vision of Harriet Tubman taking people to a freedom she had never been to. Do you understand? The first time she went, she took people with her to some place she had never been. Like, that's so powerful. Like, I'm going to risk everything and make you believe that you should risk everything to come with me someplace I've never been to. Just come on, we going. We're going to find it. I mean, that's that kind of inspiration, I think, is also almost a guarantee from what I know about the conference last time and what I know about the people who come to speak. I got the pleasure to speak with Reverend Michael at Harvard at Reverend Kevin Ross's invitation. He was doing some work at Harvard, and I got to speak with Reverend Michael. We both presented at Harvard for his public courage for Reverend Kevin's public courage in the academy, and just to be around him, to be back with my teacher, right? Just to be around him and
Yeah.
listen to his ideas and to share mine. It was just, oh, right. Back at, I got my North Star just a little bit higher, right? Amazing.
And you get the perfect segue. I want to just let some of the people know who the keynote speakers are, and just to remind them of who and what this conference is, and most importantly, why they should be there. So we're going to do that, and we're going to come right back.
People of African Descent New Thought Group are pleased to present Celebrating Our Soul, Consciously Creating Change at Unity Village, Thursday, August 1st through Sunday, August 4th. There are wonderful keynote speakers such as Lucien Baker, Reverend Dr. Michael Bernard Beckwith, Bishop Jack Bomar, Dr. Tracy Brown, Reverend Dr. Andriette Earl, Reverend Dr. Deborah Johnson, Reverend Charlene Manuel, Reverend Dr. Sheila McKeithen, and Reverend Dr. Derek B. Wells. Regular registration ends June 30th, so don't delay. Register today at padntg.com. Sponsorship opportunities are available at padntg.com. Volunteer opportunities are available at padntg.com. Go there now, padntg.com. See you there.
Wow. So that's just some of the stuff that's going to be going on at the conference. And I like to think of it, you made this reference earlier and it brought to mind, it's like a family reunion. If we, where good food, we're going to be having interaction, people are going to be walking and talking, and that is going to be one of for me, the highlights is to be able to connect, to see our people. And sometimes, doing this work, we can feel that we're on an island, that we're doing this all by ourselves. But when we can get among like-minded and like-cultured people, we can say, oh, I'm not on an island. And hey, maybe we can exchange some ideas and some understandings and some approaches to make all of this stuff a little more palatable, lighten my load as we continue to do this work, and just begin to really be the presence that is who we are. Because you made the statement just before we showed the little clip on who's going to be there about bringing politics. One of your teachers said you couldn't bring politics in. But as African American people or people of African descent, the idea of politics in the church was there from the beginning, because during our early forms of church, we had to learn secret codes of when master was coming and when he wasn't, or when it was time to run away, when Harriet was going to come by that night and pick you up and take you to freedom. And so we've always stood for justice in that way. We've always had this idea that that whatever work we do, there has to be the Spirit of God that's in it and leading it. And so I know one of the things that you're going to be doing at the conference is you're going to be involved in a panel on social justice and how do we do this, and this whole idea of celebrating conscious change. And so just give me a little bit about your feelings about that and that whole piece that you're going to be involved in.
Yeah, so I also co-founded a company, Inclusion Design Group, that does consulting for universities and mostly corporations around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And one of the things that we use is something called the Inclusive Mindset Framework. And it requires three things: that we be brave, we be humble, and we be dedicated. And I think when I talk about sacred activism, I like to use that inclusive mindset framework sometimes. And what I want to always do in my fire train go heat component is push the needle a little bit around our courage. What does it look like to be brave from our pulpits in our communities, right? To talk about being servant leaders that are serve in service to the communities around us, especially to the ones that are the most marginalized, right? So we have Fifth Sunday happening in June this month, which is, doesn't happen very often. And in this Fifth Sunday, it also happens to be Pride Month. So I'm going to be doing a service. I'm inviting this Sunday, I'll be telling people, bring queer youth to the service. We got Youth and Family Sunday and we got Pride Month. Let's bring queer youth and center them. Because I had someone write me a letter. She asked me to do a recommendation for her to ministerial school. And she talked about just the centering of queerness in a Black church and just how radical that was for her. So let's push the needle on that. Let's push the needle on our stance around war. Let's push the needle and be braver in what we're willing to commit and talk about. But also the humble part is being willing to hear that we're not getting it right? Just being willing to hear that feedback, that critique, and just take a deep breath and recognize that it's uncomfortable. And especially, I think as Black folks, I know for me, I thought I had the market cornered on, oppression, right? I remember, I'll never forget, growing up in Detroit, I didn't know anybody who spoke Spanish until I was an adult, anybody. I'll never forget the first time in California, a Latina corrected me on her name and how I was mispronouncing it. And she gave me a little neck roll and was like, no, and I was just like my whole sensibility was thrown. I'm like, I do the correcting. I am the Black woman. What do you mean? But that's the growing part, right? Is to be able to take it like we dish it out, right? Because sometimes we want to attack our allies. Even, when we were at the convention in South Carolina, there was this moment that happened that was really hard. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting, we're dealing with everybody, the religious science, Children's for Spiritual Living Convention. There was this hard moment where a microaggression happened. And with the 4 pivots as a model, Dr. Sean Jimwright's book, we're learning that those moments can be teachable if we remember to do the teaching, right? And sometimes what we do is the lashing out, right? Or the correction, right? There's a way to do that, right? There's one thing to identify it. It's another thing to teach, to use that moment to teach people, this is what happened. This is why it's important. This is what you do when you do that. Here's what we need to do as a community as a result of that. That's where I want the conversation to go, is into the being humble enough. We're in a position, we chose to be leaders. We chose to be teachers. There's a responsibility that comes with that. You know what they used to say when the folks were speaking, teach good. You got to teach good. Brother Malcolm, teach good, right? And so that part of it, and then dedicate it. I think with everything we're facing in ministry right now, right? What, you and I talked about earlier, just kind of the tendency of people to sort of push back against church and institutions and coming every Sunday and the pastor and all of those things. With everything we're facing right now, dedication is a lot. It's a lot to be dedicated to even take this job, right? And so reminding ourselves that this is a marathon, not a sprint, because you can get disheartened by this election, right? You could just totally get sidetracked. I love Reverend Deborah said last time, she said, we're not electing God. And I was like, I love her. That's why I love her so much. She said, we're not electing God. I was like, yes, ma'am. So,
one thing you bring up there, and one of our fellow New Thought ministers, Les Brown, he has this saying. He has this saying that says, and I think it's appropriate here, because as we're looking at this celebrating our soul and engaging our community of this conscious change, there's this idea of being involved where, or being committed, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
are two different things. And he gives
Mm-hmm.
this thing, he says, if you want to understand the difference between involvement and commitment, he says the next time you sit down to bacon and eggs, you can get the understanding. He says the chicken was involved, but the pig was committed. The pig had to give it all up. He had to
I
surrender
remember.
everything. And 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 that's what we are, I think, in our community, in our church communities, in our African American diaspora community. We need committed people for whatever they. If your commitment is just to bring refreshments for the service, that's
Mm-hmm.
fine. Be committed to doing that, so that I know when we get to the conference, when we get to the meeting, that part I don't have to worry about. And
Mm-hmm.
so, how do you think, or what are some ways to how we can get our people to engage in this kind of commitment, big or small? As Dr. King says, if you're going to be a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper. There's no big I's and little U's in this.
Right.
It's a oneness that we need to begin to work for. So I'd like to hear how the conference is going to kind of create that container.
So I'm on a panel on sacred activism with Dr. Tracy Brown as the moderator. So I just know you dealing with a lot of wisdom, right, in that situation. And we all have these little nuggets. So I always talk about introducing myself with my pronouns and putting them on my Zoom identity and what that does. And I can talk to, and we'll talk to, the experience of my congregation, trying to understand, what am I talking about? Why am I doing that? People, I got message, it's so irritating. Why you got to say that every time? And then I get letters from people who cried the first time they saw me do that. And they were like, wow.
Mhm.
And so it's helping people to, just like your clothing might signify your African consciousness, your jewelry might signify, these are my people understand signifying, right? So these are,
Yeah.
and so what are the little things like that, right? What are the little things
Right.
like when we have the moment for our different moments in the service where we ask people to stand? What happens if you say, stand if you feel comfortable standing? Right? Now you're
Mhm.
acknowledging that everyone's not comfortable standing, right? Or sometimes
Mhm.
I'll tell people to use the microphone. They're like, I don't need a microphone because my voice, this and that. And I was like, trust me, my voice is loud. But what I learned is from people with hearing differences, a microphone matters and the vibration. And people are always like, oh, right. The vibration of the microphone helps people with different hearing abilities. And so those little things go a long way when
Mhm.
you change your
Mhm.
language, when you make little steps. And then there's the big things like the war, where it's like, no, you need to say something during that. You cannot, because I think we have this spiritual bypass idea. And I'm like, no, saying nothing is an action. You want to talk about activists? What's the other
Yes.
option? Inactivists, right? What's the opposite? You don't
Yeah.
want to be conscious. Well, what do you want to be? Unconscious, right? So when you talked about, actually, you said something about uh, us and politics as people of African descent in being embedded in our religion. It's embedded in all religion. That's what religion is. Just like there was no medicine, but the ministers. There was no politics, but the ministers and the leaders and their relationship with each other. And throughout all of
Yeah.
history, there is this conversation in a society about whether the spiritual leader is the leader, right? Or whether the military
Yeah.
leader is the leader. This is throughout all of history, right? So is the spiritual leader the leader, or is the
Yes.
minister? And is the fact that you have military might mean that you have God on your side? Like, this has been the conversation forever. That's what all the books are about, right? It's like, how do you know God is on your side,
Yeah.
right? Because he's going to give you the land and he's
Yeah.
going to crush the people that was in the land. If that's your spiritual construct, that's the basis of all war and the basis of all politics is religion. What you mean? This is the whole basis.
Yeah.
You got a despotic God, a warmonger. I always tell people, when we look back on this period in history, this long period that is our history, we're going to say this is the time of the warmongering man God.
Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
the imbalance in the world, because religions that had balance with the divine masculine and divine feminine, they don't have the same kind of thing. Right.
No.
But it's the idea, we got this conflux of religions, the influx and confluence of religions. I done made conflux a new word, influence and the confluence of religions that come together, and all of them have a warmongering man as the God.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. So this is our job, is to speak to the divine feminine in this moment and be like, yeah, no, you're not destroying nobody and calling that God.
Right.
And so I'm gonna speak
Well,
out.
and you make a nice point there in terms of when we look at the evolution of humanity, and I love this idea of, it's not even an idea, it's an actuality of, originally the divine principle was a feminine idea, because at some point, I'm sure men looked at women who were able to create life, and they said, I can't do that. There's something there that I may have, again, it's that involvement and commitment. I may have been involved, but the mother is committed to do something different. and that so when we look at the idea of the creative source of the universe that goes by all things, and in the ancient Kabbalion tradition, is the all in all. And when we look at that idea of how we engage with life with equanimity, with this marriage, if you will, of the two different things. I love the way Abraham Hicks says, no matter what you pick up, it's really one stick. But if you get stuck on the opposite ends of the stick, you're going to have a problem. And so one of the ancient Kabbalion teachings is this whole idea of polarity, is that we in this rhythm that is based on this polarity that allows us to understand the oneness of all things. And when we begin to look at that from all aspects of life, and at this conference, we're going to be looking at it from the social justice piece, it's one thing. And there's no such thing as hot and cold. There is an idea of temperature, and there are varying degrees on that scale. So please tell me where hot begins and cold ends on your scale, because it's different for everybody. And so when we begin to have these kind of conversations at the People of African Descent organization, at the conference of Celebrating Our Soul, and then narrowing that down to social justice, we begin to unravel some of these mysteries, if you will.
Yes.
Hence the mystery teachings, is that we take it and break it down and show you this mystery is really the ocean, the swell of life. And when you can get this, you can unravel all the mysteries. And so I look forward to seeing you at the conference.
Yes.
I look forward to being at the conference and just soaking in that energy. And I just want to say, I'm so glad we had this time together. And is there anything else that you would want to just bring forth about anything at this point? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. And I can't, if you can imagine what it's going to be like at Unity Village from August 1st to the 4th, where this goes on, all night, all day, your cup will be full. So is there anything else that we would be knowing and looking for from your perspective?
Yeah, I think you were headed in the direction I was going to go, which is don't miss it. I know our lives are busy. We got so much going on. Who's going to preach on that Sunday? And I'll just show a video of you preaching from before. It'll be all right. Everybody will be okay. Just be there, because you deserve the opportunity to be fed. We are always doing the feeding. And you cannot, when we do circle, I always ask my people, one hand to give, one hand to receive, in how they hold hands in a circle. One hand to give over and one hand to receive under, because we're out of balance. So come to the conference so you could be fed, right? Because I need you and you need us, and let's all do it together. I can't wait. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. And so please come and join us at Celebrating Our Soul Conference 2024, August 1st through the 4th in Unity Village. with the theme of consciously creating change. It's going to be mind blowing, if you will. And I look forward to seeing you and anyone and everyone else who shows up. So thank you for being with us today and sharing your heart and your soul with us. And let's go forth, create, and make the world a better place. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
This fantastic interview was just an example of the depth and content of those presenting at Celebrating Our Soul, Consciously Creating Change. Go to padntg.com to register. Be there for it.